Next, we want to focus more on observational studies. We recall from the previous video that data that arises where no treatment has been explicitly applied to observation to experimental units would be a form of data called observational data. In observational studies, you see, when we make causal conclusions based on experiments, that is reasonable because of some of the controls we have put in place while designing the experiment. However, please note that making the same causal conclusions based on observational data from observational studies can be very deceptive and is not recommended or highly advised against. Thus, observational studies are generally only sufficient to show association between the explanatory and the response variable, or to form hypotheses that we can later check using experiments, which are more closely um, guarded. Now, as far as observational studies are concerned, there are two major forms of observational studies. One is a prospective observational study, which identifies individuals and collects what information as events unfold, so it projects into the future. On the other hand, we have retrospective observational studies, which collects data after events have taken place. So, researchers may review past events in medical records. These two types of what or forms of observational studies are not entirely mutually exclusive because sometimes we might be studying a phenomenon continuously. That means we've collected data values about that phenomena in the past and we continue now and also into the future. So some data sets may contain both prospectively and retrospectively collected what variables. A popular question that students usually ask is, why is it that in observational studies we can only show association? Why can't we claim causation? Why? And that is because we are weary of the fact that when conducting observational studies, what we call confounding variables may creep into that study. So let's take an example. Let's look at this plot, for instance. And this plot talks about ice cream sales in blue and shark attacks. They seem to follow a similar trend. In other words, just considering how closely the trend is, one might be led to think that um, an increase in shark attacks has some connection with an increase in ice cream sales because they seem to be pulling each other along the same lines because they are intertwined. One might be led to think that way. But then, when we bring in everyday common sense to play, we realize that doesn't make any sense. So, when you see the results of a study that shows something like this, you might begin to question your intuition. Would stopping what? The sales of ice creams then stop what? Shark attacks? Well, not necessarily. Whenever we see this might be a moment to consider the impact of confounding variables on the results of a study. They tend to confound the results, mess up what? The interpretation of the results of a study. When I see results like this, you would usually suspect that there is a confounding variable at play. What is a confounding variable? Well, let's see. Let's delve a little bit deeper here. If you consider ice cream sales and you consider the rate of incidence of shark attacks, you will agree with me that as it warms up outside, people tend to take more of ice cream. People also what tend to be more out in the beach, which can expose individuals to what incidents of shark attacks. So, what is this confounding variable that was not considered initially in the study? This is temperature outside, or just the temperature. So, a confounding variable in this instance is temperature. So temperature is what is called a confounding variable, which is a variable that is associated with both the explanatory and the response variables. In more technical terms, a confounding variable is an underlying difference, something that makes an impact on both the explanatory variable and the response variable between two groups that we might be comparing, and then it tends to confuse or mess us up when we try to reach a conclusion, as we saw in this case. So very, very crucial. Confounding variables are a constant feature in observational studies. Take, for instance, when we talked about investigating if smoking while pregnant affects the birth of a baby at birth. Well, we can only conduct an observational study, but if we end up seeing that babies' births for mothers who smoke tend to be what lower than for mothers who do not smoke, there is probably no way to actually attribute or to say that anytime a baby's weight is low at birth, that it can only be attributed to what? To the mom's smoking. That is not necessarily true because there might be other factors at play. Those other factors are what we call confounding variables, and they might also what have an impact on the response variable. Whenever we want to avoid confounding, sometimes in experiments, we tend to what assign individuals to the treatment and control groups at random. This is one of the controls in place when you're conducting experiments that helps to control for the impact of confounding variables.